everybody. It is Mike Levin on Sunday, October 10th, 2021. The light will be a little better in this driving video. It's around 8:30 a.m. and I'm driving off to pick off my kid from camping, roughly in the Palisades in New Jersey. And I'm coming from the Poconos, so it's about an hour and a half drive without terrible traffic. I should have the shorter version of the trip today as opposed to Friday night when I hit Friday night commuter traffic. It's always nicer driving on a Sunday morning. So, what do I have to talk about? Well, first of all, I am finally updating Pipulate, free and open source software for SEO, and I am doing it under Jupyter Notebook, which it was last time as well. It was designed to be used in notebooks before. However, this time it's under nbdev under Jupyter Notebooks. So it shall be a fully loadable into notebooks package in addition to a pip installable package. Things take on this bizarro parallel life identity in nbdev and Jupyter Notebooks. On the one hand, you have everything in your export cell or cells, which are actually also in your current notebook. So you can either start a notebook or you use their already existing notebook that they seem to prepare for you with their naming convention. Who is this? What is there? Howard Jeremy Howard, something like that. But it's not fast.api, it's fast.ai, okay? I've had these things confused a little bit in prior videos, but there's two fast A dot star I's. It's only one character, so I should work on my regex, but there's two companies out there that sound very similar, two companies, two endeavors, two projects. One of them is Fast AI, which is what I'm talking about. It's Jeremy Howard. I think I have the guy's name right, but he's trying to bring into being a vision for programming that existed like 50 years ago. I'll have to get that other person's name, but it was a vision of living interactive code that you can explore, you can understand how it works, it never stops running, and that's today's REPL, read, eval, print loop, which has been expressed so well in the browser environment using the text fields of a browser form for code blocks and programming. And you run those a block at a time, and between that, execution is essentially frozen with all your variable values accessible for investigation. You can continue to run a block at a time. It's just a really wonderful environment for learning and for ad hoc work session coding. Some of the words I've been throwing around in recent videos, I do work session type work, I do ad hoc, I do on-demand coding. And as a matter of fact, I am not a professional developer. I'm not hired as that. That's not the words on my resume, etc. I'm in the field of search engine optimization. If I were to change it these days, I would probably put data engineer. I do not have quite the hubris to put data scientist. I never got any of those degrees. I have no master's degree. I got a bachelor's. So I can be an engineer. Plenty of it. Engineers have only bachelor's degrees. So I'm a data engineer. And I do a lot of performance art as a data engineer. Let's go crawl a website. Okay, let's go crawl that website. Now, whereas 99% of SEOs out there would break out Screaming Frog, and the remaining percent, half would go to Deep Crawl for enterprise scale crawls, leveraging the cloud, and the other 0.5% would use tools like I use, either built yourself or pip installed. Scrapey is a popular one that comes to mind. But Scrapey has its own API. Remember I talk about these third-party packages, these pip installable packages, things that are not part of the Python standard library. One of the main things they do is invent their own API extensions to the Python language, which is a new API layered on top of it. Very often riffing off of prior Python APIs. The one from pandas to do rows and columns out of tabular data, their .lock and their .ilock come to mind. Their slicing notation is more or less borrowed from standard Python. They get rid of some of the, what do they get rid of? Because it's range, comma, range. Ranges often have square brackets around them. So in conventional Python slice notation, you would have nested square brackets in a lot of fancy slicing and sub-slicing commands. Python pandas, the import pandas as PD, increasingly ubiquitous statement library, gets rid of one of the square brackets, one of the necessary. In fact, I think they're not even allowed where they would go in standard Python in their slicing notation, so it comes off as just an outer square brackets with range, comma, range. And it creates some very interesting statements that people who don't understand Python and Python slices and implied square brackets would really have a difficult time understanding. It would look like a request for a tuple to people who understand Python but not pandas. And for people who don't know pandas or Python, it would look like just mysterious placement of commas and colons. Yet it's an invented API that makes perfect sense to those people who are in the know, indoctrinated into the ways of Python slices and pandas sub-dialect of slices for use in the .loc and the .iloc methods, functions, sub-slice selectors, if you will. So APIs are invented by packages. My pipulate package invents a few light APIs, and they are mostly self-discoverable through dir and built-in help, and hopefully soon command line completion. I'll be doing all those same tricks that people do, so that when you hit tab or start to type on one of your custom functions, a IntelliSense-like menu pops up showing you its options, and maybe even a little built-in documentation to show what each of those options does with hover commands. So I'm still learning about that. nbdev sets you up for a little bit of that. There's some sort of all thing in there. I really got to look into it, where it provides definitions, the nbdev template that you get with nbdev new, or use this template from GitHub in a kind of clone where you clone someone else's repo over into your own repo without ever coming local at all, but then you can git clone it. This stuff gives you some of the basic file layout and syntaxes you'll be using. Among those, which include some of the tricks, some of the real tricks that nbdev does in order to blend seamlessly well with a Python packaging index, the Twine upload system that uses, and what else? A number of other things that just the way you can import files conveniently in Jupyter notebooks using relative paths to where you are. Everything sort of dovetails together into what I once imagined as a pipulate product. You would have some sort of control center that is not on rails, that is not rigid, that does not provide forms and fields like the way Screaming Frog web crawler does. You're on Rails. It does one thing, right? It does a lot. It has a lot of features, but it crawls sites. And crawling a site is just one of the many things Pipulate is able to do. And it gets strung up with a very Unix-like, piping the output of one process to the input of the other, and in turn piping its output to the input of yet another thing, and so on down the line, in order to create complex deliverables. Complex deliverables that are a derivative of multiple processes and have, easily modifiable automations, so that you can respin these deliverables in different ways. And so that was the vision I was going after back in the day with Pipulate. I mean, this is going back to, I don't know, let's say 2017, 2018. And I had created my own server context for it. It was pretty clever. I had it running completely out of Linux, my own version of Linux that is a spin of QEMU, PC emulator. So it's a version of Linux that comes with its own Linux server. You didn't have to install it on anything. You just double-clicked it on the desktop of your Mac or your Windows system, or even your Linux desktop system, your GNOME or KDE system, and you would have a server pop up, and that server would be running my Pipulate software. And then you could go to a web browser, and much the way Jupyter works today, with a terminal window that stays open, you can minimize it, but it's always still really there because server's got to run somewhere, and a web browser that through a local host address or such knows where to find the server, you have Pipulate free and open source software. I did that on Linux. That was some really stupid IT tricks, stupid pet tricks of IT, because I used all the most stable and known QEMU versions, right? These were compiled binaries made available on the interwebs for x86, IBM PC compatible Windows machines, and for Macs. So I went and dug up and compiled, in the case of Linux, the best QEMU binaries for each platform. And then I used the Mac's packaging system, where things are put into a folder and then made to look like a program. So you double click the icon that's on a folder, and it's really a bundle of stuff, and it executes using a script, the stuff that's inside the folder. I actually, in conjunction with a guy named, Howard, well, I forget his name at the moment, it'll come back to me, but I did this on the Amiga with a program called WBScript. A programmer friend of mine helped me attach icons to directories or folders that, when clicked, it saw WBScript was the program to run, and then it found a script inside that directory of the right name, or it loaded the script out of the icon's metadata. I forget exactly the details. And then it executed it as a, fully privileged command line script. And it was a powerful way to make bundles of software and dependencies that you could click, drag around on your system. And when you double click, it always just ran correctly, finding all its dependencies relative to its own directory path. And so these tricks are still in use today. The Mac uses it heavily. And when I made Linux, I made the whole thing packaged in a directory like that. So when on the Mac, it packages and moves around like a single file, like a Mac package. When on Windows, it just is the place where the files for Windows are loaded from. And I made this magic cocktail mix. And this is not a video about Linux, but this is how dear to my heart nomadic portable code execution environments are. In the previous videos, I've been referring to it as a unit of computing, borrowing the terminology from Intel's NUC computers, their Raspberry Pi competitors. that they put out in all different clever form factors. Because they're Intel, they can put an entire x86 computer onto an SC card, onto a memory card looking thing as small as the memory cards that go into your phones and game consoles and I guess digital cameras, if such things are still around. And the version of the Blade server that goes with that looks like a little USB port, but it's got SD card slots and multiple NUCs can go in there. And it was a very creative way for Intel to flex its muscle, going, Raspberry Pi, that's nothing. Look what we can do. We're Intel. But it amounts to nothing because the ecosystem that sprung up around the Raspberry Pi was explosive. And it, I guess, followed suit on the Arduino, which also did it very well as a microcontroller, but not a full microcomputer. And the Raspberry Pi did it with a full microcomputer and, graphics-capable desktop, so you could have a visual desktop like Ubuntu desktop, and that's what evolved into Raspbian. I guess the Raspbian repository and desktop operating system, which is just another spin on Debian, the same way Ubuntu is. So derived from Ubuntu, one of the primary, I guess, root, distros of Linux are Ubuntu, which comes from a company called Canonical, which Microsoft has partnered with to bring the version that's pushed on you with a Windows subsystem for Linux. So Canonical's Ubuntu Linux has gone all mainstream. Prior to that, to get mainstream, you would have needed to go onto the versions that IBM brought to market as the first billion-dollar Linux that was spun off, I guess, as a separate company, maybe, as Red Hat Linux, from which the consumer Mandrake version was done, and Fedora, the free and open source Fedora, and I believe the CentOS, the very popular CentOS Enterprise version, was derived from. And of course, just Red Hat Linux itself is a very popular name. I believe that refers to the enterprise level. But now there's and as a repo, this used the RPM, which was part of the official POSIX standard for Unix. So when you're looking for a POSIX compliant Linux, you really got to go to the Red Hat derivative ones. But POSIX compliance is overrated because who needs to put your depository software management system under a Unix specification? There are more loose standards for what is fully compliant Unix, with which Linux wants to be compatible, under which the Debian derivatives that are more Microsoft in flavor these days would be considered fully compliant. I forget what the names of those, Linux Foundation standards or whatever, I don't know, but POSIX compliant or POSIX compatible portable operating system standard definition is overrated. You don't need that. You wouldn't be that if you were using Ubuntu under Windows subsystem for Linux. Not POSIX compliant, but perfectly fine. All these tangents. Where am I going with all this? Yeah, where I'm going is the server context to run pipulate is provided by the same server context to run Jupyter Notebook. I would be crazy to not dump all my prior stuff and to piggyback off of that and to have all the, to have the product I always envisioned with one pip install. Pip install pipulate, and then under the notebook, you import pipulate. I've been coming to not even import pipulate as some abbreviated name, like the way pandas and NumPy do it. All the cool kids are doing it these days, but I think for right now I'm still going with just pip install pipulate, import pipulate. It's the easy instructions to give out. It's a snappy, memorable name. It's not too long. And in the way people will use it in its crazy schismed duality modes, right? Because it's going to be a .py package that the Python packaging index installs when you pip install, but it's going to have a whole nother life when you clone the repo from GitHub. That's how to get the upper level directories. That stuff might get put deep down in your system under system setup, something like that. I forget what those directories are called, but when you pip install, it does put it in some mysterious subfolders that you never actually go in and visit. So when you're creating a package that has documentation and support files, that next directory level up in your repo, that stuff is invisible to most users who pip install. You only get that if you git clone, or you only get that in an accessible way that's easy to surf into and interact with as a notebook, as a Jupyter notebook. So I guess that will be the intro to people that I provide when I talk about Linux, Python, Vim, and Git. Linux, Python, Vim are all very much in your face. The text editor you use every day, the thing that's involved in almost every process, the thing that becomes part of your muscle memory, Vim is in your face. Linux and Python are fairly in your face too, because it's what you boot up into, it's what you run your code on. And then Python, it's the dialect, it's the language that you write in. So you got your Linux, Python, and Vim all very much forefront, marketing themselves to you in your psyche. Git is always that last one, the oh yeah, don't forget. And you don't have to learn too much about it unless you're collaborating with a team on software. Then you got to start learning about, forks and branches and stuff. But until then, it's just your own infinite undo and a way to keep your code in multiple locations so you never lose it. You never lose an edit, and you never lose the code. And there's two forms of security. There's security against loss, and there's security against prying eyes. So, if you pay GitHub for its ability to have private repos, then you have security against prying eyes when you create repos in GitHub. You can always use, I believe it's Bitbucket, the Joel Spolsky alternative, that actually used Mercurial first, but I think it's, moved completely over to Git. Git 1. It used to be Git versus other distributed version control systems, among which was the HG program under Python, native Python. I started out on that. I was like, oh, it's Git command compatible, yet it's native Python, so I could integrate it into my package. Visions of stars in my eyes. So I started out with Mercurial, and everything I did with, Git, like Git commit, I did with Mercurial, HG commit. But over the years, it became so obvious that Git won, so my stack, my code execution environment, my dev platform, instead of Linux, Python, Vim, and Mercurial, the more Pythonic one, I went with Linux, Python, Vim, and Git because you yield to the overwhelming winning 80-20 rule in the mainstream. So you got your mainstream, you got your average distribution curve of what gets used, and in that fat middle of the average distribution curve right now is Python and JavaScript. Off to the sides, as it slopes off, you got languages like Java is there. It's still in heavy use. The consulting world still loves it. Bill them for lines of code. Java's your language. And then you've got variations on C, like C++, object-oriented, Apple's Objective-C. And then you've got, as the slope continues down the edges, you've got special edge cases. All concurrent all the time. Memory safe, parallelizable on the same machine, parallelizable across internet node networks, remote processing machines. there you got your Golang from Google, invented by the same guy as who invented Unix. Ken Thompson created the Golang, along with I think it's Robert Pike. I always got to check that first name. Rob Pike sounds right. But one of the Unix/Linux file system people, together with the Unix creator, created the Go language. I'm sure there were other contributors. I don't want to sell anyone short, but they invented the Golang for Google to speed up their systems processing stuff, to get better concurrent compiled code, better garbage collection, and faster compiles, so they didn't lose all that time compiling C++. 30% of an organization's time could be lost waiting for compiles. So the Go language scratched that itch and got a lot of other stuff for free at the same time, like easy deployable EXEs against machines with the same architecture. And that was all very important for Google. And a lot of people say, oh, Python too slow? Reprogram that in the Go language. They jump on that particular bandwagon because it's some powerfully good kung fu, and there should be people jumping on that bandwagon, just not everyone seeking optimized performance and find themselves disappointed by Python on the first or even second pass. There's always compiled Python languages that use fewer dynamic data types in their, choice of things you can do. Because if you use them, you lose those speed advantages. If you stick to numeric arrays, that kind of stuff compiles, and you get C-level performance out of Python. So, what am I saying? Where am I going here? Yeah, so... I reached a point where I wanted the tools that I've made to be pip installable. And Python provides for that now as part of their standard distribution, the standard library, the standard Python ecosystem has the pip package manager built in finally. So now it's on equal footing with newer languages like Node.js that had NPM built in, but not really. It was still third party. People don't realize that the NPM system under Node was commercial third party sufficiently that that Microsoft came along and bought it. So if you're NPMing yourself anything under Node.js and you're thinking, oh, this is all Google technology because it was extracted from the V8 engine of the Chrome web browser, and the Node.js executable is kind of like the Google, blessed JavaScript execution engine made available for servers. Well, the NPM software repository system that it uses is actually owned, not just contributed from free and open source, but they got you by the gonads with NPM. They're not going to do anything to abuse that power in the similar way that they're turning out to be good stewards of the GitHub software repo, because Microsoft bought that too. So Microsoft owns your GitHub repos and Microsoft owns your NPM packaging. So Microsoft owns a lot in the developer tool chain. You still call it that, developer ecosystem, the must-haves, must-uses. And they're doing a Hail Mary to make sure that your text editor falls under that category too. VS Code, your text editor /IDE. They are very determined to make sure you stay in the Microsoft family, and whether they're extracting money from you or not today, they are coding extremely powerful Microsoft dependencies into your habits, into your workflow, so they always have the option in the future, the right of first refusal for reaching into your pocket and pulling out whatever your annual, developer guild dues, which I'm paying for now in the form of private repos on GitHub. They pulled it off. Microsoft turned them into the Adobe of the developer world, because you got to pay Adobe your got to pay Adobe your $500 or $600 a year graphic arts guild dues. Yeah. So being the premier software developers, 43, I got to decide which route I'm going to trust and take. I am going to take the I-80 all the way. That's fine. My GPS will adapt. At least you don't hear it now. But I am making these real-time decisions about routes to get up to the Palisades, and I can do 287, a little bit more roundabouts, but you avoid the Manhattan, the George Washington Bridge traffic as you get to New York. Or you could stay on Route 80 and basically go north from there, but you got to deal with the GWB traffic. So I'm going to deal with the Manhattan traffic for a slightly easier route. But you guys don't need to know that, and you didn't need to hear my GPS, so I figured that out, how to keep that silent. So yeah, pip install pipulate. Oh, the code went dead. Code goes dead when you put it into a .py, except Microsoft is making sure it stays alive. So you don't need to have things as a Jupyter notebook in order to have the IPython REPL, the read eval print loop, the delightful part of Jupyter Notebook, to be available to you natively in VS Code. You see, VS Code is borrowing a lot from the IPython and Jupyter projects so that you don't have notebook envy from VS Code. VS Code is eliminating Python envy, Jupyter envy, IPython envy by embedding all the best parts of those free and open source projects natively into VS Code. Do you see how brilliant that is? And they're even taking the next step of making one of the main pain points of notebooks. They don't live well in Git. Jupyter notebooks and IPython notebooks don't live well as Git repositories because of all the trashy metacode that gets inserted into the picture there. Large Git diffs of things that are not relevant. So by merely using VS Code and .py files, you scratch that itch and you get rid of that. However, they're not notebooks. You don't have your embedded markdown. You don't have the notebook ecosystem. You don't have the duality of a package on the one hand that doesn't exist until you export it, so it becomes sort of like a use this snapshot, and your live notebook on the right hand side where you can use that package and get really experimental and work sessiony and ad hoc in nature, and do these delightful work sessions without jeopardizing your more pure and pristine exported package, which is also represented as the cells that have the export comment at the top of that same notebook you're working in ad hoc form. It's all beginning to click. This is the new pipulate. The new pipulate is just one application under nbdev, under Jupyter, under Python, under JavaScript, under the browser, and so on, through your ziggurat of layers. It's not always my particularly favorite way to work with such a ziggurat of heavyweight dependencies, not the least of which is this latest nbdev dependency I added to the picture. So you need to be on a graphical desktop system that can support, a browser so that you can have Jupyter notebooks. And so this whole cascading, dependency thing exists. So it's got to be a pretty heavyweight desktop platform. I'm actually trying to do it with my phone now. Either Juno, the Jupyter notebooks on the mobile phone of the iPhone, or Carnets, I think it's with a K, I gotta double check, but there's two of them now that are Jupyter Notebook under your phone, but only one of them is at Python 3.9, the other's stuck at Python 3.6, so that pretty much makes my decision. They both, with enough finagling, can import all but your compiled binaries, but with wheels, there's a chance those get installed properly, even for your iPhone. Maybe it'll use 64-bit ARM, who knows. But both of these packages exist because of the popularity of Jupyter Notebook via Anaconda, the Anaconda install, which means both of these packages are going to endeavor to install at least pandas. You're going to want to at least want pandas on your iPhone. So Carnets and Juno, one or the other, I'll be getting Pipulate to work with its whole, potentially even nbdev part of it. But certainly, even without nbdev, it'll be useful to use those notebooks. To use those, live notebooks that let you pipulate and override and modify the core pipulate parts, because they'll be exposed there under the cells that have the export comment at the top of them. You won't need nbdev installed to actually do that, so there's a chance I'll be pipulating from my mobile phone just as well as from any other platform under either Carnets or Juno, and I'll never have to develop a mobile desktop pipulate app. The Jupyter Notebook ones are it. I don't even have to say will be it, are already it. I have run pipulate off of mobile phones in the past. I know this works, and on Android, only all the easier. So I know this all works. I'm only talking about adding my more advanced features like site crawls and such to it, getting it under nbdev, getting the master file, which will probably, I gotta get rid of those master terminologies. It's not politically correct. Everyone's switching to main and alternatively core. So the default file name under nbdev is 00_core.py. And I don't think I'm going to try and fight it. I'll live with it. I'll use the numbering system. I'm back to the basic programming language. Line 10, line 20, 00_core. It's leaving plenty of space for incrementing numbers and different core files, and it is identifying it as the most important thing about your application. So most of the things that this guy, Howard Jeremy, I want to say, of fast.ai and nbdev got right. I forget what I was even saying. Most things Howard Jeremy of nbdev and fast.ai got right. They got the file layout correct so that it's staging you for success with the Python packaging index and pip installer. It's getting things right with file naming conventions so that you understand that core files are core files, yet it leaves you room for growth. It gets things right with having the bizarro duality syncing between directories, which is almost never done right. rsync type stuff. It's almost never done right. But it's done right here because you live in your notebook and you flip off to the side your latest packages as you need them. And that very same thing that you're sitting on as a notebook that has the in current namespace, all those packages, can also be tested in the namespace of an imported package of the same name. It blows my mind. I've been waiting for this for a while. And then anything can be extracted as automations, thrown over to the headless environment, including the Chrome browser stuff through Pipulate and headless webheads and stuff that can still process Chrome automation. It's amazing. I'm getting to that real soon. That will be under Pipulate. It's one of the things I'm rounding in from separate projects under one umbrella. All the text surrounding my thought process regarding the industry shall go on What's a Metaphor IO. What's a Metaphor.io. What's a Metaphor.io. I like it. Industry scuttlebutt there. That's my build this up into a content site. Staged for potentially selling one day, staged for AdSense revenue, whatever. Certainly the place where I'll organize my YouTube videos and publish to using the GitHub Jekyll Pages system, the GitHub IO system. Which I guess is what inspired me to use .io. It's becoming popular here and there, but probably the main driver of .io popularity is the GitHub.io pages that you get for free as published documentation pages if you want them with every GitHub repo. It's just an amazing, compelling reason to use that as your main centralized repository. And I'm going to be wrapping up soon because I'm going to have to pay attention to the driving instructions as I get closer to the GWB and go through this astoundingly complex set of jug handles to get you onto the Palisades Highway from there. So I'll be wrapping up real soon. I think I've made most of my points. On my live video this morning, you saw me turn my existing Pipulate GitHub repo, not the GitHub one technically yet, but at least my local copy of that Git repo into an nbdev repo. It added the core, the 00_core.ipynb file, and I tested the duality trick of notebook and package existing at the same time. Now it's just a copy-paste job to round all my stuff up in there. The decisions whether to use the object-oriented approach that I used under OAuth, O-H-A-W-F, because OAuth authentication, O-A-U-T-H, too, is O-awful, O-H-A-W-F. So you can use my OAuth library for OAuth 2, Google authentication, to use the build, library, package, whatever it is, to build Google services, to use build to build services for any Google service that you connect to, usually using the with context manager. Oh, I'm learning so much good stuff about how all this works. And backend all your cached data with SQLite using the standard Python library dictionary API. It just magically becomes persistent. And everything is coming together. All these things are like perfect storm in nature. And I'm an SEO again, although I'll be calling myself a data engineer. And I'm doing it for purposes other than SEO greatly these days. Reverse engineer. Instead of taking a site and pushing on a rope, trying to get the site to perform better in search by convincing people to do stuff. SEO is a lot of pushing on ropes, a lot of wheel spinnings, a lot of metaphors. What's a Metaphor IO? You'll learn. Come to What's a Metaphor IO. I'll talk about all this fun, happy industry stuff. But instead of pushing on those ropes, it's much preferable to pull on ropes and to look for sites that should be doing better based on their content, profile, performance in search, targeted keywords, etc. And identify them for various purposes. And I'm kind of becoming a reverse SEO, and I love it. And it's applicable to many more things than what I'm applying it to here, which is the always necessary first step in any data science project. First, you need your data. Then you need to make sure your data is staged for success. Normalized, sampled down, cleaned, outliers removed, whatever have you. It could be any one of countless things. Transformed, turned from JSON to CSVs. There's all kinds of stuff that could be done. Flattened, hierarchialized, and grouped. Okay, anyway, you get the idea. You master all that. You just master it through SQL, traditional SQL-like stuff, the more recent interpretations of SQL type actions through the Pandas API, and then doing it actually through real SQL again, through SQLite, which is always there and ready to serve you. Maybe occasionally through raw SQL strings, because you'll always be able to use the raw SQL string dialect of SQLite. It's not so vendor dependent because there's not really a vendor. It's free and open source, so worth learning the SQLite syntax. Okay, I really have to wrap up here. Left 3 lanes for New York City for I-80. But it's a good place to wrap it up. You learn all your database stuff. You learn data transforms, particularly using a traditional outer loop to loop through your collected data, and then list comprehensions on your inner loop to do field mapping to a data structure. That's a very common data transform signature in the Python world more and more these days. An outer loop for grokability so that you can even understand what it is you're doing. And then for each field inside the loop, you do field mapping, X for X in field, so that you can extract JSON to flat file. That's very typical application of such a transform. Pythonic transforms, master them, and you'll be golden. You'll be able to work in any company, in any endeavor, in any country, in any language, in the medical field, in the research and science field, in the financial field, in the business, it's endless. Nonprofits and volunteer organizations would love to have you. It's the ultimate eternal obsolescence-proof work. And it's under Python because it's what the data scientists are grabbing on. And I struggled with that for a long time. You're not talking to someone who is just religiously holding on to this. I tried to do agnostic data transformations through the XSLT, the XSL transform language, because it was pure XML. And you didn't need a language in particular, but you still had all local exits, express-only local exits. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again soon, and don't forget to subscribe.